Tonight, we won't march beneath banners or count the miles to a holy city. Instead, we'll find ourselves in the gray hush after a victory, the kind that leaves the air too quiet. The sea hums behind the tents. Rain slips down ropes and into open ledgers. Somewhere, a soldier is mending a strap that won't survive the next journey, and a clerk is adding the cost of nails to a list that already feels heavier than faith. The crusade has paused, not in triumph, but in calculation. The fires burn low, not for warmth, but for counting. And at the center of it all stands a king who has learned that glory is expensive, and that wisdom sometimes means stopping before the hill begins. So lower the lights. Let the sound of rain on canvas settle over you like a slow drumbeat. And if your breathing begins to match it, steady, quiet, almost resigned, that's all right. Some victories are meant to be heard that way. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing, and if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next whisper of rain will remember you there. And somewhere past that whisper of rain, a flag shivers against the dawn. The wind tastes like salt and ink, the kind that dries too slowly on ledgers written after a battle. Acre lies behind them now, taken, tallied, and already costing more to keep than it was to win. The sea murmurs like a banker counting debts. The tents slump like tired clerks. Between the sound of the waves and the scratch of quills, you can almost hear a question forming, not about faith, but about math. That's where our story begins, in the calm that victory forgot to fill. The inland road was not only a line on a map, but a long list of small, needy objects. Water skins that needed water, shoes that wanted to remain shoes, ropes that hoped not to become interesting. Each day away from the fleet was a day spent inventing new problems for carts. The fleet was the army's moving belly flour, salted meat, spare cordage, hope. Every step east tugged on that umbilical line. You can try a little experiment at home, carry a full bucket away from a tap, then decide whether you want to climb a set of stairs with it. Put a winter wind in your hallway. Add people asking whether the bucket might be borrowed for just a moment. The thought of hauling trebuchet parts over hills that behave like damp pastry encouraged sober reflection. And then there were the nights, splendid and expensive, mounted on animals that ate as if they were helping. A horse is a beautiful argument for staying near a ship. These were the quiet, muddy calculations that drifted through the camp as scouts traced the path toward a city that glittered at the horizon of scripture. The rhetoric of sermons tends to promise a straight road. The road was not straight. It was damp, thoughtful, and lined with ditches that had personality. Somewhere between the 10th and 11th mile, a soldier probably invented the world's first field-tested complaint about wheels. If the first act was an abacus laid over a map, the second was a tape measure stretched across stone and weather. Jerusalem looked magnificent if you began at the walls and ended at the sky. Scouts who walked the circuits looked for less romantic things: cisterns, sluices, culverts, where the rebuilt worked after Saladin went right, where it went wrong, who would fix it if you broke it, where would your garrison drink while repairs happened, and how often would someone try to interfere with that water out of a sense of enterprise? A city can be taken. A city can also be held, which is an entirely different sport. It resembles keeping a garden alive when your watering can lives an inconvenient distance away. Chronicles describe the defenses as adequate in a tone one reserves for a bridge that will hold the weight of a cart unless you have the habit of holding your breath when crossing. But the real puzzle was the ring outside the ring, the fields and roads, the wells and mills, the market villages, the grain moving in and the taxes moving out. A Christian Jerusalem without its countryside would be a shell kept polished by very tired men. Walls do not bake bread. They watch other people bake bread and then expect a cut. The city had been rebuilt since its last shock. Towers rose where sketches said towers should rise. Those towers would require men. Men required food. food required escort. Escort required more men, who also required food. It was the sort of tidy circle that keeps commanders awake, or, in this series, gently puts viewers to sleep. The weather practiced strategy of its own. Winter has many useful qualities, but it is famously poor at holding bowstrings at a cheerful tension. Rain swelled wood. Fog drifted into formations and rearranged them into ghostly, less certain shapes. The wind carried messages between campfires and returned with rumors. The countryside had learned 1,000 small ways to fight without a battle, delay a convoy, lead a column into a valley that collects mud, close a gate that rarely matters until today, sell fodder at a price that makes the buyer nostalgic for yesterday. Mounted archers moved like punctuation, appearing where a sentence looked finished, adding a small, persuasive comma that meant not yet. This was the unseen enemy, not a glorious clash, but an environment that always showed up to work. In the evenings, tents hummed with damp. Armor waited for morning with the resigned patience of furniture. You can walk straight at a city if the ground agrees to remain under your feet. Jerusalem never moved. The earth around it did. After a few days of this, even the optimistic noticed that courage is not a reliable replacement for a bridge. The third movement of the thought process happens after you lean over a table and draw tomorrow with your finger. Suppose the city falls, the finger writes. What then? The answer list runs longer than you expect. To keep the prize, Richard would need Ashkelon refitted into a solid hinge on the coast because hinges make doors useful. You can have a door without a hinge, but then it is just a plank you lean against things. He would need the southern road guarded like a secret and the wells along it kept friendly. He would need engines repaired, horses not merely alive but interested, and a crown placed on a head willing to keep it on while the wind tugged at it from all sides. He would need lords not already married to other promises, and treaties that behaved just as written, a charming dream in any century. There is an image from one chronicle of a tent in a storm. It looks secure until a rope frays. A captured city can become a tent if you forget to tie down the corners. Meanwhile, the calendar insisted on continuing. Reinforcements were a rumor with good manners. The king's enemies could ask Egypt for news and receive, by and by, a very large letter written in grain. It is friendly to imagine a triumph as a full stop. In reality, it is a comma that obliges you to finish the sentence. A city taken in January asks questions in February about garrisons and roof tiles. One of Richard's more sensible habits was refusing to bully the next season into obedience with a trumpet. He liked a splendid assault as much as anyone, but he liked living armies more. If tomorrow requires men you no longer have, today's victory is a pageant, not a policy. This is not quite the stuff of epic, but it is the beating heart of strategy. A crown with no chin strap is a short story. The moment he sketched the post-siege diagram, the costs assembled like polite creditors. All of them hoped to be paid first. When you include the price of 400 small necessities, a glorious plan can start to look like a very expensive hobby. So the decision arrived, as decisions often do, not in a single shout, but as a stack of small reasons balanced until the pile quietly refused to fall. Richard chose the coast. The coast had ships, ships had bellies. Bellies could be filled by people not currently being shot at. He looked at Jaffa and Ashkelon and saw not only harbors, but the shape of a living supply line that could be defended without teaching geology to oxen. Ashkelon needed work. The place sat like a hinge that had been left in a drawer and remembered rust at inconvenient moments. The king's carpenters and masons began to persuade it back into usefulness. The plan traded breadth for depth. Fewer places, held better. Shorter roads, patrolled. Posts that could talk to each other by sea if the land grew unfriendly. It is amazing how restful a short road looks after a long one has tried to swallow you. The army, still proud and a little tired, discovered that staying dry helps courage stay polite. Out of this coastal grammar came a quiet masterpiece, a truce designed for feet. The agreement did not make poems happy. It made pilgrims possible. Unarmed travelers could visit the city without an escort of every hungry problem in the district. It pleased devout people who mainly wanted to pray, and it pleased accountants who mainly wanted not to walk spreadsheets into desserts. It preserved a living frontier instead of a dramatic, brittle one. Saladin kept the city, the Crusaders kept the coast. The sea kept being the sea, which is all anyone asks of it. Historians whose hobby is the long view notice that this preserved more options than a road army would have. Options are underrated. They are the modest, cardigan-wearing relatives of glory, and they pay rent on time. None of this meant the king had gone soft. He fought when fighting was unavoidable and when winning was possible without throwing good tendons after bad. When raids threatened the coast, he met them with brisk practicality, marching quickly on roads that knew his shape, supporting garrisons that could hear the sound of oars if they listened. He turned a geography headache into a set of solvable chores. It is not the stuff of tapestries, unless you enjoy tapestries of men repairing piers and inspecting cisterns, which admittedly I do, but it kept the army warm and the next season open. You could, if you insisted on romance, say that he chose to keep a door ajar instead of slamming it open, and then discovering there was no furniture on the other side. A small, particularly sleepy detail concerns the treaty's language about repairs. Who fixes which wall? Who leaves which pile of stones alone? How many guards are too many for a peaceful gate? The clauses read like an argument about garden fences between unusually literate neighbors. It is all very calm until you realize that behind every politely agreed number stands a garrison wishing to be anywhere else. Pilgrims walked to the Holy Sepulchre in that careful window, and shopkeepers learned the useful phrase mixed currency accepted, the wind, which had not been consulted when on being itself. Some soldiers who had dreamed of standing on the city's walls and announcing things muttered. Announcing things is satisfying in any century. Their commanders made tea-colored decisions instead of red ones, and the campaign continued to exist. A crusade unbroken by overreach is not the tale people expect, but it is the tale a quartermaster will happily read twice. There's also the matter of time, which behaves like a second logistics branch. Every day not spent besieging was a day spent maintaining. Timber fetched, rope knotted, nails counted, horses shod, scouts sent, letters answered with a degree of politeness that suggests everyone was also a little tired of letters. The coast turned these routines into routines rather than emergencies. You could predict where flour would be in 10 days, which is a luxury soldiers enjoy more than songs admit. Ships arrived with a slow punctuality of weather. When storms closed a harbor, there was another harbor, because the decision had produced a line of them. The map began to resemble a necklace instead of a spear. Necklaces break less dramatically and can be repaired with thread. To some chroniclers, all this looks like caution. To others, it looks like discipline, the discipline to refuse a battle offered by the landscape in a mocking tone. Richard's fame as a fighter remained intact because he fought when the ground let him be loud. The famous charge at Arsif is remembered like a trumpet. The decision after Acre is remembered like a ledger closing. Both required nerve. One required more subtraction. It is difficult to write a song about a subtraction that saves everyone from a later subtraction, but if you hum softly, you can almost manage it. The moral, if such things are allowed at bedtime, is that sometimes the cleverest victory is choosing a battlefield that won't devour your breakfast. We end with a quiet image rather than a flourish. A coastal watchtower at dusk, its steps damp with the day's salt. A guard looks out and sees a line of fires along the shore, small and regular, each one a post alive because a decision was made to keep it within reach of ships. Inland, the high ground fades into a thoughtful gray. Somewhere beyond, the city sits under its weather, unchanged by trumpets that were not blown. On the sand, carpenters tidy tools, then argue, gently, about rope. Officers mark figures in wax and smooth them away with the side of a thumb. A clerk writes a letter explaining that pilgrims pass safely today, and a scribe adds a neat line about repairs at Ashkelon proceeding as expected, which is the most beautiful promise a supply officer can make. The sea breathes. The fires along the coast keep their slow rhythm. The smartest battle remains unfought, and the army sleeps within walking distance of breakfast. You might not expect a kingdom to fall asleep over a loaf, but medieval England more or less tried, and the result has the comforting drowsiness of warm bread cooling on a sill. The assize of bread and ale, a regulation so thorough that it told bakers how large a loaf should be. Today, tomorrow, and on any day when the wind remembered to change the price of grain. If you're still conscious by the time we get to the little wooden pegs clerks pushed along a table to calculate flour allowances, feel free to subscribe or don't. The statute will continue making loaves quietly average, without your help or mine. Picture a market morning after rain. Scales hang like patient birds. A reeve with an inked thumb carries a shallow box of wheat, because the day's prices begin with volume, not poetry. Grain is weighed, then argued with, then weighed again. Somewhere a bell announces nothing in particular, only the fact that bells like to be involved. In the corner, a baker inspects last night's heat inside the oven by putting his palm close to the mouth and pretending he can count with skin. The assize speaks softly over all of this bustle. It says that when wheat is dear, the loaf is small. When wheat is cheap, the loaf is generous. Always the price to the customer remains steady enough that a person can walk to the stall with a coin and come away with supper without doing math. The law is less a command than a table, a pleasant grid that translates grain into ounces with the serenity of a librarian translating size into shelf marks. It was not invented to make bread poetic. It was invented so that nobody's dinner would depend on bargaining with the weather. That grid, which is the dull hero of our story, came from an old political promise that weights and measures would be one throughout the realm. Medieval life admired this principle the way a cat admires a bath, solemnly at a distance while arranging its whiskers into arguments. One village stretched an owl like a long afternoon. The next snipped it like a busy clerk. Market men therefore learned to carry two talents at once, lifting sacks and lifting eyebrows. A national table for bread was a genteel attempt to let people stop memorizing their neighbors' interpretations of length. It worked by beginning every morning in wheat and ending every morning in loaf. Officials often called ale tasters or bread weighers, although I enjoy the searchers best since it makes them sound like a contemplative order checked the going rate for a quarter of wheat in the county, compared it with a table, and produced the correct weight for a farthing loaf, a halfpenny loaf, and the respectable penny loaf that could sit on a table almost like a guest. I like to imagine them sliding a little bead along a cord. Price here, therefore weight there. It is not thrilling, but it is gloriously predictable. Predictability is the lullaby of commerce. The artistry, if we're permitted to call it that, lay in the way the law respected ovens. Ovens are stubborn rooms that happen to be horizontal. Every village oven had its personality, and the table stepped around that personality by allowing the loaf as weight to float while its price stayed pinned. A penny always bought bread, but what you carried home would change with the harvest. This meant a household learned to read the year with its hands. A heavy loaf, good wheat. A lighter loaf, a conversation about porridge. There is a mild, irresistible absurdity in the fact that the statute never bothered to standardize taste. A compliant loaf could be heroic or moody. It only needed to weigh the appointed amount when a reeve set a scale on the bakery counter and looked thoughtful. Somewhere in the same market, the ale taster applied a leather cup to a brewer's barrel, took a sip with the solemnity of a small sacrament. and declared the ale good, insufficiently good, or liable to make anyone who drank it write a poem against civic order. Bread and ale together formed a single seesaw of daily comfort. The law also packed a pocketbook of scoldings. Cheats earned picturesque penalties, the pillory, the tumbrel ride, or, in one favorite town custom, the assize loaf, which meant your faulty bread was publicly displayed like a pamphlet here, is what not to do before being sold for charity. The pillory scenes are the least sleepy part of the story, but even they drift into bureaucracy. First you inspected the loaf with a standard weight kept in a chest by the guild. Then you recorded the fine in a margin with admirable penmanship. Then you spent the fine mending a sluice or a footbridge. Then eventually a traveler walked safely over that bridge to buy a perfectly correct loaf. The entire process hums like a mill, grain in, rulebook humming, town improved one board at a time. Inside bakeries, the statute had the secret effect of turning heat into paperwork. A baker's day was already a choreographed yawn. Wake when the moon looks like a scratched coin. Knead dough until your arms remember their ancestors. Shove loaves into a mouth of brick. And talk to your fire like an old friend who sometimes pretends not to hear you. The assize added the rhythm of the scale. Loaves came off the peel and onto a board. The board moved to the balance. The balance nodded yes or no. Excess went into the vantage loaf, a small pile of trim that could be handed to the poor or shaped into rolls and sold depending on custom. In many places, a grander version of this fairness lived in the baker's dozen. The 13th loaf added to an order of 12 to keep favor with both customer and statute. We call it generosity. Bakers called it insurance against ovens that had opinions about moisture. Today, a baker's dozen is a friendly phrase. Then it was also an actuarial table disguised as kindness. If the second act of our slow play is how the law tasted bread, the third is how people tasted the law. Households learned the table by experience. Children were dispatched with a coin and a finger sized for the handle of a basket, and returned with a loaf that taught them the price of rain. Stewards in great houses measured loaves like small architects, breaking them along their crumb to evaluate generosity. Soldiers learned the traveling version of the statute. When a royal army bought bread, it paid with standardized optimism. The king was not fond of surprises that could be prevented with arithmetic. In port towns, where wheat met ship captains with flexible ideas about volume, the assize argued with tides in patient Latin. In border markets, it met the local habit of weighing with stones of curious ancestry. This stone said to have been a Roman pound, that stone the size of a saint's shoulder. One stone allegedly reliable since the good winter. The statute frowned, a very English frown that begins as a sigh and ends as a ledger, and urged everyone to use a standard weight kept under lock. Keys multiplied. Chained measures sat on shelves like quiet authorities. Some towns chained their standard weights the way monasteries chained books, which tells you what they feared losing. There are sweet micro-stories tucked into this otherwise serene policy. One town pretended to enforce the assize, then forgot where it had put the official weight. It borrowed a neighbor's weight and immediately accused its own bakers of fraud. Another town cheerfully fined bakers for loaves that were airy good for chewing, but treacherous on a scale. A smart baker answered by briefly resting loaves under a damp cloth. The moisture crept in like a minor character and added an ounce of obedience. A reeve discovered the trick, laughed, fined him anyway, and advised him to stop teaching the apprentices bad habits. In Norwich, a clerk wrote so many assize entries in one column that the margin curled like a quiet wave. In London, the guild wrote its own working version of the table and enforced it with the luxury of an organization that had its own dinners to attend. Everywhere, someone complained that the ale taster liked to be thorough. Thoroughness increases with the number of barrels one has not paid for. The fourth scene is the long exhale, what it meant for a society to agree that bread should be dull. Dullness is underrated. A daily staple is a promise, and promises keep best when they taste of routine. By smoothing the jagged edge of the market, the assize let households plan beyond tomorrow. It radiated out into other measurements, bushels, gallons, yards, because once you standardize a loaf, you begin to suspect that other objects might also appreciate a calm square of rules. Weights became municipal celebrities. They were carried to fairs with a dignity previously reserved for saints or well-behaved geese. They sat on tables at audit time while aldermen nodded to them as one nods to a wise aunt whose advice you cannot afford to ignore. The statute also created jobs of exquisite smallness: the man who cleaned the balance pans, the woman who kept a record of the rain and claimed it explained everything, the apprentice who learned to cut dough into equitable cousins. There's nothing dramatic about any of this. That is precisely its charm. Standard loaves slowly taught people to trust strangers. A pilgrim could cross 3 counties and buy the same penny loaf without needing to learn a new accent and arithmetic. Merchants could plan how much bread an expedition would entail. Towns could predict how many fines would pay for repairing the East Gate after the cart with the enormous wheels tried to be impressive again. The realm became a little more one realm, not because a banner said so, but because an ounce here was an ounce there, and a penny became a door you could walk through without explaining yourself. If you have ever used a power outlet in a different country and had to shrug at the shape of the holes, you have reenacted, in reverse, the medieval joy of finding the same loaf in consecutive towns. The people who built cathedrals also built compatible breakfasts. Of course, the world's fondness for exceptions continued to practice its scales. When famine struck, the table showed a moral face. The loaf shrank until it made no sense to sell misery. Then charity took the stage with its quieter rules. In good years, bakers developed styles long, short, round, plated, that were all legal so long as they could sit obediently on a balance. Foreign breads caused opinion pieces long before opinion pieces had newsprint, and occasionally a combination of spices and confidence caused a fine to appear along with an invitation to bake again, but less interestingly. The statute did not care for innovation. It liked Monday to look like Monday. It would have enjoyed spreadsheets. Across centuries, the assize blurred at the edges. Metrics changed, mills modernized, tastes wandered, and the state discovered that it liked taxing other things more than loaves. But the habit it taught never quite left. The public comfort with the idea that some goods should be both boring and fair. We still queue for this promised bread, milk, bus tickets, municipal water, and feel quietly affronted if the promise stumbles. When a store advertises a standard loaf today, it is borrowing confidence earned by officials who once carried standard weights, like portable sermons. Somewhere a museum drawer holds a set of brass pounds with a crown mark, and the drawer smells like dust and faint importance. If you open it, you can almost hear the clink they made when a reeve checked a loaf and nodded without looking up. There's a late-night tenderness to the idea that most people, most days, did not argue about their bread. They argued about fences, taxes, marriages, and whether the bell should ring twice at dusk. That the loaf sat on the table with its quiet resume. I cost what I cost yesterday. I weigh what the weather allows. I am not exciting. I am yours. A mother cut it into reliable fractions with a knife that had no opinion about politics. A worker tucked a piece into a pouch that had known many pennies. A clerk with beautiful handwriting recorded that the bakers of the parish had paid their fees and that the ale was good enough to make the evening mild. In one small town, a boy learned the habit of tapping a loaf with a finger to hear the hollow sound of a good crust, and he became an adult who trusted the tap as much as the scale. The law had taught him a sound that meant enough. If you listen very quietly, you can invent the market again. The creak of the balance, the rustle of sacks, the brief perfunctory sip of the ale tester, the baker's mutter about heat that escaped during matins, and the satisfied, almost drowsy thump of a compliant loaf landing in a basket. This is not the history that wins duels. It is the history that makes duels unnecessary by ensuring the fighters had breakfast. The assize of bread and ale was a long, careful conversation between weather and appetite, conducted in ounces and coins. It made ordinary days possible, which is the highest praise a law can earn. And so, as the market shutters come down and the cats inspect the counters for nothing in particular, the table continues to hold its numbers. The standard weights drowse in their chest, and the world drifts gently toward evening, full, unexcited, and quietly sure of tomorrow's loaf. You might not expect the cooling time of melted beeswax to decide whether a letter felt important or just pleasantly sticky, but in much of medieval Europe, the day moved forward at the speed of a seal. The wax had to be warm enough to flow, cool enough to keep its shape, and docile enough to accept a stamp without sulking into a puddle. If you're still awake by the time we get to the debate over thread versus parchment tags, feel free to subscribe or don't. The wax will set all the same, with the same quiet dignity it has shown for 8 centuries. Imagine an office before offices, a long table under a window, rushes on the floor, a clerk with a knife and a calm expression. The letter has been folded into a tidy packet that looks like a small pillow. A narrow slit has been cut. A parchment tag has been drawn through like a shoelace. The kettle of wax sits nearby in a small iron spoon or a terracotta ladle scorched by competence. The clerk tests the heat with the back of a fingernail, which is not in any handbook but is universally understood. He breathes once as if to study the wax and pours. A cherry of gloss grows on the fold. The room waits. Wax is the sort of material that likes to pretend it is already finished. Touch it too soon and it sighs into fingerprints. Wait too long and it will reject the matrix with a faint squeak, preserving an impression of nothing in particular. Somewhere on a shelf rests the seal itself, a small disc engraved with a sign that will travel farther than most people travel in a lifetime. A device. A saint, a bit of dog. Latin that looks wonderful while saying the administrative equivalent of yours sincerely. The clerk warms, the face lightly or breathes on it as if sharing a secret, presses straight down, counts with the patience of a person who has counted what feels like most of Christendom, and lifts. The image emerges, not dramatic, but definite. Wax has closed the future in a polite circle. No one ever calls it a supply chain, but everything in the wax's life has been prepared for this moment. Bees rummage through meadows. Beekeepers coax combs from hives with an optimism that bees sometimes admired and sometimes stung. Raw wax smelled faintly of sunshine and complaint. Merchants mixed the wax with resins and a little tallow or turpentine, depending on the region and the recipe that lived in somebody's head, like a family song. If the seal needed color, and the important ones usually did, pigment was folded into the warmth. Vermilion for cardinal decisions. Green for long charters that intended to survive more than their writers, plain yellow for everything else that had work to do but no ambition. Recipes differed just enough to keep collectors busy later. French Chancery green leaned a little toward moss. English greens were fond of brown company. The Empire experimented with a vegetable temper that made archivists sniff the document and say, politely, interesting. There were debates about how hard a seal should be. Hard wax traveled well and broke cleanly if someone tried to peek. Soft wax forgave elbows and survived the winter in a bag. A diplomat might carry sticks of both like a traveler with day and night socks. There were even office jokes, the small kind good offices enjoy. Call that a king's wax. I've seen church candles stiffer. The tools learned the rhythm. Matrices, the engraved dies, were kept in little pouches like amicable coins or hung from chains like medallions. Some institutions divided authority between 2 seals, a greater and a lesser, which is a very human way of saying, we will know who asked for this by the size of the circle. Great seals were usually 2-sided and dangled from cords, so that the document wore its decision like jewelry. Lesser seals were stamped directly on the fold, practical as a button. The cords inspired their own etiquette: silk for solemnity, hemp when silk would be a costume, red and green twisted together for charters that wished to look festive while speaking Latin about drainage rights. A surprising number of people preferred parchment tags cut from the document's own margin and threaded back through it, which satisfied the philosophical need to be sealed to oneself. If there was a bureaucracy in heaven, it surely admired that detail. Clerks kept knives sharp for cutting tidy tongues along the edges, and somewhere in the stack of common wisdom there existed a rule about how far from the line of writing a tag ought to begin. No one agreed on the number. Everyone agreed that you could tell a town's character by how cleanly it slit its parchment. There is a sleepy heroism in the way wax indexed the day. The seal attached to a charter told you not only who approved it, but when the office remembered to breathe between crises. English kings added pellets around the edge every reign or two. Municipal councils carved new matrices when the old ones looked tired. Monasteries decided, after a long reflection and a soup, to include the abbey's patron holding the correct instrument, the key, the sword, the wheel, so the saints would not have to answer correspondence about mistaken identity. That wheel is actually a spiked instrument of martyrdom, a monk might explain gently, as if describing weather. Seals also taught people to recognize places by touch, which is the most endearing skill any archive can offer. Close your eyes and you can feel the fat sturdiness of a 13th century London seal, the crisp, almost impatient bite of a Florentine commune, the gummy kindness of a bishopric that reused wax because thrift is next to godliness. Sometimes the image blundered into comedy. There exists, preserved like a yawn in amber, a seal of a city where the engraver misunderstood what a ship should look like and produced what appears to be an enthusiastic cupboard under sail. The city used it for 30 years. Nobody died. The sea continued. And yet, for all the ritual, much of sealing was housekeeping. Boxes labeled wax multiplied like contented cats. A conscientious clerk wrote down how many sticks went to the Western Embassy, and who had borrowed the green ladle, and when they had promised to return it, Monday, which expanded in the ledger as Mondays do. Apprentices learned to strain wax through cloth to remove crumbs of old seals and accidental furniture. They also learned to carry newly sealed charters on a board, like a landscape of small red ponds. In winter, the board went near the hearth, and you watched carefully for bubbles. In summer, the board hid from sunbeams that had very modern ideas about performance. Every office had at least one person who could repair a seal after mishap. The repairers worked with a needle warmed in their fingers, teasing edges back together, and spoke to the wax as if it were a shy animal. If a fragment had flaked away, they pasted it back with a paste made of flour and patience. If the seal had broken entirely, they reattached it with a thin wafer of fresh wax that insisted on being invisible. You could call this conservation, but they called it Tuesday. The business of secrecy made its own furniture. Private letters were folded into shapes with charming names: the tuck and slot, the lockfold, the pleat with tongue, and sealed, so that any entry would leave a confession in crumbs. Merchants sent packets sealed with an entire family of impressions: the father's signet, the eldest son's, the warehouse mark that resembled a grid that resembled a warehouse. People learned to watch for unusual neatness. A suspiciously smooth seal meant someone had warmed and repressed it, a trick that honest people practiced and dishonest people perfected. There were countermeasures because humans enjoy adversarial hobbies. Some offices impressed a string into the wax before stamping, so that the texture would never reappear exactly if tampered with. Others dusted the warm face with carbon or a pinch of ground pigment that would resist imitation the way a cat resists invitations. Notaries, never a species to miss an opportunity to complicate virtue, added little flourishes along the edge, a tiny star, a ring of dots that allowed them to say under oath and coffee, "Yes, that is mine," and "No, I did not create it on a bad afternoon." Some days history lies down for a nap in the middle of the workroom. You can hear it in the long minutes when a big seal cools, because big seals are stubborn moons. Royal pendants the size of biscuits needed a quiet climate and a patience not yet legislated. The wax was poured into a metal box called a bulla, lined with parchment circles stamped with the royal device and then pressed. It set from edge to center like a lake thinking about winter. Someone always waved a piece of cardboard in encouragement. Someone else hummed. Letters waited like courteous geese. Pages of the pipe rolls leaned against each other to whisper through their figures again, just in case an extra shilling had fallen between lines. The wax firmed, and the office breathed out and began to tie cords, neatly, 2 loops, a knot learned by muscle memory 3 secretaries ago. It is not a thrilling scene. It is, however, exactly how power kept its promises before printers took up typing. What do you do with a lifetime of wax? You shelve it. Across Europe, civic chests filled with documents that were seals like medals. The chest carpenters took this seriously. 3 locks, 1 key per alderman, so no one person could open the future. Inside, bundles slept in chronological order that occasionally enjoyed a detour. Heavy seals made the bundles into creatures. You lifted a charter by its tag, and it wagged. In some places, clerks wrapped the seals in soft linen caps to prevent chipping. In others, they left them bare, which made the box smell like a candlelit chapel. Archivists learned to cradle seals with the hand under, not the thumb over, a rule that has saved more history than most battles. When a document had to travel to court, the seal went in a little wooden biscuit tin of its own, padded with tow. A beetle carried the tin as if it contained a very small saint. In the record books, marginal notes followed seals like a chorus. Sig, fract, for broken. Sig, perdit, for lost. Sig, ironic, would have been too modern, but the temptation must have been there. There's also the way wax invents people after they are gone. Many signet rings survive because someone mislaid them in rivers or fomented them into jewelry boxes after fashion moved on. Their faces are tiny autobiographies. A dolphin for a merchant who liked to brag about speed. A bunch of grapes for a vintner who liked to brag about storage. A knotted rope for a sailor who could tie anything to anything else. A pious motto for a soul who hoped wax could add a feather to judgment's scale. Some bare hands clasped in agreement, which might be the only moment 2 medieval hands held together without arguing about boundaries. When you look at enough seals, you realize the Middle Ages drew itself most kindly at 20 millimeters diameter. Bishops are confident but not ominous. Castles are compact, and cheerful lions look like cats who have passed an exam. The engravers, anonymous, deft, steady, must have had opinions about their clients. Somewhere there is an invisible shrug cut into copper. If you are still with me, and if you have drifted, the wax understands there is a final, very quiet trick that seals taught, how to count time by touch. A seal worn smooth at the high point speaks of many hands and many readings. A crisp one says the document was filed and allowed to dream. Green wax, used for long charters, left its color on the inside of chests like season rings. In an abbey, a series of seals shows the succession of abbots without needing to read the text. This one chose a crozier with a little curl. This one likes straight lines. This one widened the borders as though the world would appreciate more pattern. Crowns change shape across reigns the way hats change shape across decades, which is to say with some enthusiasm and much insistence. A royal seal can answer questions that no chronicle remembered to ask. When did the beaded border become a rope? When did the horse start lifting a leg in the gallop of optimism? When did the Latin decide to abbreviate just there? Every change is a version of a sigh. Things seldom switch quickly in wax. They purr their way into novelty. Meanwhile, the practical world kept making tea. A village court met on a Wednesday, wrote a judgment about who owed whom 3 hens, and sealed it in yellow. A university appointed a lecturer to read logic so gently that students could sleep and learn simultaneously. The diploma received a black and white silk cord because some committees also enjoy gossip. A merchant as company adopted a new mark after the old one proved too much like a neighbor. S. The notary apologized to nobody and drafted a notarial sign that resembled a comet trapped in lace. All of it sealed, folded, stacked, left to care for itself while people went home to supper. In winter, the same clerk who breathed on matrices also breathed on his hands and dried them over a brazier that illustrated the doctrine of necessary things. He cleaned stray flecks of wax from the table with the back of his knife and thought about nothing much. A good day in an office is one that reduces things without breaking them. Centuries later, the wax survives in archives the way silence survives in churches. It chips if you look sternly at it. It flowers into whitish bloom in damp weather and then recedes once the room has made up its mind. Archivists dab broken edges with consolidants that have gentler names than glue. They cradle ragged seals on little foam trays shaped like patience. When they teach you to turn a charter, they say, start with the seal, and you understand this to mean, start with the part that remembers being held. Scholars who secretly love gadgets arrive in reading rooms and go, quiet before pieces of wax that once arrived at a town gate with trumpets. It is a funny reversal. The smallest thing keeps the largest audience. The modern world keeps a few souvenirs. A notary's raised stamp still imitates the reassuring bruise of a matrix. A tamper evidence sticker on a parcel behaves like a cousin who prefers plastic. The strings on legal documents nod to the old courts. Even the tiny red dot you click to seal. A form on a screen is an echo of bees who thought they were simply looking for flowers. None of these are as fragrant as the original, which carried the memory of smoke and meadow. But the idea beneath them is the same lullaby. This is closed as promised. In a life busy with open tabs, that is almost an act of mercy. At night, when the reading room is dark and the documents regroup into bundles, I like to think the seals hold their images gently, not so much proud as amused that they have been asked to persist. The wax does not know the names it kept, yet it kept them. The cords do not know the hands they tied for, yet they remember the knot. The matrices sleep in drawers lined with felt, their faces turned down so they cannot gather the dust of new decisions. If you pick one up carefully, with permission, in good light and tilt it, the mirror image suddenly looks right, and the person on it looks back at you with the friendly impartiality of a device designed to outlast opinions. You can almost hear a clerk in a long-vanished room whispering to the wax, "There, good, hold still." While someone folds a letter and another, someone warms the spoon, and the window lets in weather with no further comment. And as the wax cools, everything cools a little. The sentence, the transaction, the day, the circle strengthens. The packet grows a small red moon. You put it down to set, and by the time it has set, the world is already quieter, as if it too has pressed its face into a soft material and agreed not to move. You might not expect a wooden stick to run a city, but for a few hundred calm years, the L1 did exactly that, inch by patient inch. It was not glamorous. It did not flash in sunlight. It simply lay across counters like a polite horizon while people tried to sell each other linen. If you're still awake by the time we get to the part about half L's, quarter L's, and the controversial finger, you may subscribe, or you may nod off and let the almager, the official measure, keep watch. He has been watching for centuries. The wand is smooth from hands that never hurried. On market mornings, a draper sets it down with the solemnity some people reserve for family portraits. The stick is the length of a local agreement. In one town is 27 inches, and another it is 37, and in a few particularly self-confident places, it is whatever a board nailed to the guild hall says it is that year. Merchants bring cloth rolled like quiet thunder. The onager unrolls, aligns one selvage with the wand's brass tip, and lets the rest fall into order, the way a flag settles when the air decides to stop being interesting. He peers along the grain, hums the tune of fairness, and marks the end with a little snip. If the L is longer this year, there is a minute of collective blinking. If shorter, the town experiences a small rise in civic happiness that can be heard in the number of satisfied throat clearings around noon. The wand, indifferent, remains a line. Every wand had a personality tucked into its edges. Some were metal-shod, modestly armored against enthusiastic customers. Some carried the town's arms and a stamp that could, with enough good humor, be kissed. A few were made of cherry wood that looked friendly under candlelight. A conscientious onager kept several, because market life is fond of contingency. One wand for wet days when fibers sulked and swelled. One for dry spells when cloth shrank into its better self. One ancient exemplar wrapped in linen and only brought out when two respectable people had stopped being respectable. There were traveling pocket wands, two little folding rules with brass hinges that snapped open with the seriousness of a prayer book. Tailors tucked them into sleeves. They measured a shoulder as though pouring tea. They measured a hem as though confiding. The words went with the wands. Au, ulmus, ulna, ulna again. As if the Latin elbow had lent its name and never minded the borrowing. In some places you bought cloth by the ell and thread by the skein, in others by the yard and the nail. A nail was 2 1/4 inches, and also, if you were unlucky, the reason you discovered a coat's sleeves at your wrists in November. The nail measured what the wand could not reach easily, like a helpful cousin at gatherings. People argued about length with the nicest manners. The city promised a standard and then proceeded to have several. London kept a yard of iron at Guildhall. Paris kissed a toys into a wall. In Bruges they put little notches along the stone of the cloth hall so that no one could claim sudden forgetfulness. Travelers learned to translate. A bolt of linen that had been generously long in Ypres came home to Cologne slightly shorter without changing its mind. The experienced merchant allowed for this with a serene arithmetic that develops when your profits depend on weather and wand. Every so often, someone tried to widen an L by leaning while measuring. The onager had a phrase for this, which in all languages boiled down to, kindly remove your enthusiasm from the board. There was also the opposite crime, the tight pull that starved a length into thrift. Markets remember these gestures as well as people's names. Behind the wand ran the whole quiet industry of making cloth behave. Weavers warped looms with a geometry that would put a mathematician to sleep, not by boredom but by relief. Fullers trod the woven lengths in that or sent them through the new water-driven mills, where mallets understood the doctrine of repetition. Cloth left the mill damp and righteous, wanting to be wider than it was. It met the tenor field, a yard of frames and hooks where links were stretched out to dry and to forget their old opinions. Those hooks are still out there in phrases left us all on tenor hooks, though in practice they were simply an organized way to tell cloth the truth. When the wind blew across a whole tenor field, you could imagine the town's economy breathing. The wand waited at the end of the process like a kindly examiner who has already decided to pass the student if the arithmetic does not protest. People sometimes asked whether measurement created honesty or merely recorded it. The onager, who preferred bread to philosophy, said that numbers were a kind of bread, and then proved it by buying lunch. Not all measuring was horizontal. Churches grew little iron studs and masonry scratches at eye level on their outer walls so that the town could remember an L. Even when the market slept, children were lifted to touch them, as if taste could travel through fingertips. Pilgrims compared their staffs to local customs. Carpenters borrowed the L for boards. Somewhere in a ledger, a thoughtful person wrote that the L in our town is the length of Master John, his arm from elbow to fingernail, and everyone agreed. which tells you as much about Master John as it does about geometry. There were ceremonial moments, too. When a new wand was made, the guild masters watched while the old one lay beside it like a parent. They compared, sighed, nodded, and then said something very small and official, such as, "So, the world is this long again?" If the wand was the visible rule, the almager's seal was the punctuation. After cloth passed across the board, a small pair of lead tags, 2 discs joined by a narrow strip, were pressed through a slit and clamped with a die until the town-as mark looked back with the quiet confidence of a coin. It did not make the cloth stronger, it made the promises clearer. One disc faced outward where a customer might read it in a shop years later. The other faced inward, whispering to the threads. Lead cloth seals survive in fields like elderly breadcrumbs. They bear dates, names, meaning compressed into a thumbprint that never decays. There were also wax seals for special consignments, with saints who looked faintly domesticated by commerce. If the seal was missing when a roll arrived, someone frowned, then someone else produced tea, and between them the market found a compromise, which is the natural habitat of tea. We might be tempted to think all this fussy precision mattered because of taxation. It did. The crown preferred its dues predictable. Towns liked to boast that their ale came with a conscience. But there was a gentler reason as well, the reason of sleeves that meet wrists and tablecloths that reach corners. Measurement brought dignity to domestic hope. A bride who bought 6 ells of unbleached linen understood that she was buying time, soaking, beetling, whitening across grass, hemming in the same chair every evening until spring entered the cloth like weather. The wand promised that 6 ells would indeed be 6. It was a small promise. Civilization runs on small promises fulfilled at scale. Traveling with a wand made you a diplomat. You learned to nod where the local ell nodded. You learned that in some fairs the merchant measured with the cloth wrapped around the rule, cylindrical and amiable, while in others it lay flat and pure. You learned to spot the cloth that had been sewn to by tenterhooks a little too enthusiastically, thin at the edges like biscuits stored badly. Good drapers could read cloth with their knuckles. They flicked a corner and listened to the note, which said more in a second than a paragraph could manage without becoming impolite. They could also fold a length into halves and halves of halves until it sat like a book that knew its subject. Then they slid it across the wand, not to discover truth, since they already knew it, but to announce truth in the format the town respected. Bureaucracy can be a ceremony when the people inside it are patient. Occasionally a dispute wanted theater. 2 parties met under the eyes carved above the guild hall door. The alnager produced the master wand, the one wrapped like a relic. He unrolled the linen with unnecessary slowness because slowness is part of accuracy. He aligned one end and laid a square across the width to prove the selvage straight. Then he spoke softly to the measuring line, as if negotiation with wood helped. Both parties counted out loud, which kept the numbers honest. Sometimes a small crowd joined in, because a chorus does for arithmetic what drums do for marching. The decision arrived as all good decisions do, feeling both inevitable and merciful. A tally was scratched in a notebook. 1 merchant instructed. 1 ell explained. 1 town improved by a breath. The ledger did not say improved, but the alnager remembered it that way. Markets like to hang measures over their entrances like amulets. A bushel, a gallon, a wand, all debating quietly with gravity. Rain filled the bushel and then did not count. Pigeon sat on the gallon and did not apologize. The wand hung in the shade, gathering dust made largely of people. When a child asked why the town needed a stick to tell it what it already knew, the nearest adult answered that the stick remembered on cold days. Some places set their standard ell and iron along a doorway so that anyone entering commerce had to pass under length itself, which is not a bad metaphor for adulthood. Blacksmiths made copies, and there were fines for copying badly. But the fines were gentle, like most medieval punishments for mathematical sins. The assumption was error, not malice, and the solution was usually to measure again with tea present. The wand also attended tailoring, where measurement turned into intimacy conducted through chalk. Tailors measured a person's owl differently depending on posture, ambition, and whether a recent feast had confused the waist. A sleeve length could be a conversation about future weight. There were domestic dimensions not recorded in statutes, the width of a favorite book under the arm, the distance a coat must cover to keep bread warm on the walk home, the extra inch for dignity. Tailors kept notched rules that remembered returning clients. A line next to a name marked the year someone grew tired of fashion and settled into comfort, which is the runway show aging deserves. Cloth obeyed the wand in the shop and the body in the street. Both were right. It would be easy to say that standardization arrived and yawned away the old equivalents. The yard learned to be 36 inches with a voice that left no room for dialect. Napoleon tidied the own into meters and wore satisfaction like a uniform. But the old wands survived in drawers because drawers love history. They re-emerged when someone renovated a shop and found a bit of wood with brass at one end and a row of dots that looked like a constellation. Museums label them with compassion. Wooden measuring rule, probably local L, early 16th century. Wood and brass, 98 centimeters, provenance. A cupboard tireless in its duties. When you hold such a wand carefully with permission, you feel the polish left by poems that had budgets. The edges are a little rounded, not by negligence, but by generosity. The brass tip has dozens of tiny cuts from the knife that marked ends for honest payment. If you listen, the wand tells you how many people could sleep well because a sleeve was the promised length. The very quietest thing about all this is that measurement teaches towns to trust themselves. A line agreed upon becomes a place to stand. Our L, people say, the way they say our weather and our saints. It is not about superiority. It is about familiarity with a particular distance. And even as the units merged across countries and yards learned to be twins, people kept local habits. Bakers' dozens in corners, thumbs that still knew 2 1/4 inches without looking. The alnager retired when the job dissolved into other jobs, but the wand did not mind. It lay down in a chest, still exactly as long as it always been. At night, the market is a long empty room that remembers bodies, the way parchment remembers light. The stalls fold, the pigeons commute, a cat patrols with the sleepy authority of an unpaid municipal employee. Somewhere in the dark, a wand leans where it was left. It has done nothing dramatic. It has not defeated a rival stick. It has not expanded or contracted with ideology. It has permitted people to say this much and not less. The wind passes along the row of shuttered shops like the hand of time finding the edges of a page. The town's measures hang and think about gravity. If you were to walk there and lay your hand along the wand, you could feel how smooth it is, how stubbornly ordinary, how exactly the length of a good day. And in the hush, you could imagine the alnager counting softly as he always did 1 owl, and another and a nail for luck, and then resting his palms on the board as if to say that the world, for the moment, is measurable and enough. You might not expect a town to remember its borders by gently whacking them with sticks, yet for centuries that is more or less how it worked. Parishes, boroughs, little clusters of houses with as many geese as voters, each of them kept the shape of itself by walking it. Once a year, or in a year when arguments looked likely, a rope of neighbors set out in a long, patient loop. They carried willow wands because tradition said willow remembered. They wore ordinary shoes because extraordinary shoes would only slow things down. If you happen to stay awake through the part where 3 men politely debate whether a certain stone is to be touched or smoked, you're welcome to subscribe. If you drift off, the procession will keep walking without you and wave kindly when they pass your dreams again next year. At first light, the church bell made a friendly fuss. The sexton unlocked a wooden chest that smelled of damp cord and old chalk, and someone read aloud a list of landmarks in the unhurried voice used for recipes and weather warnings. This list had the lovely title, The Terrier, which sounded like a small dog, but was in fact a map made of words. It said things like from the willow by Hartley Ditch to the stone called Bullseye, then to the oak that leans, thence along the hedge to the place of nettles where a pot once stood. It would be hard to publish as an atlas, but it kept the town honest. Children were conscripted, not for their speed, but for their future. The elders wanted the boundaries tucked into young memory like a folded handkerchief. Boys, usually boys, because customs have long legs, were bumped on certain stones, so they would remember their shins first and the law second. No one sued. The stones were considered educational. A baker brought a basket of small loaves meant for pockets. A cooper came because barrels are social by nature. Even the local skeptic came because he preferred to doubt on foot. The walk began, where it always did, which is to say, at a place that felt like a beginning. A parish liked to start at water, a ford shallow enough to keep dignity, a weir that muttered about fish rights, a slow section of river that wore the sunlight like polished copper. The first willow was touched with the tip of a wand until the tree had been officially reminded its responsibilities. Then the party stepped out with the odd, enjoyable rhythm of many feet trying not to step on each other. Dogs joined. Geese regarded, because they always regard. The line went along field edges, by ditches with academic interest in drainage, across stiles that had opinions about knees. Every so often, the vicar hummed a psalm that measured time better than a watch. A man at the back carefully recorded that they had perambulated the hedge and found it in temperate health. If the hedge was in a mood, they noted that too. At a boundary brook, they paused to negotiate the old ceremony of getting wet on purpose. Geography loves damp jokes. The record might say through water by the depth of 2 inches, a muslin spate, then by the depth of conversation. People rolled up their garments with the seriousness of librarians rolling up scrolls and stepped in. It was cold enough to wake ankles. Someone said a line about Jordan quietly, not because anyone thought this brook was grand, but because a comparison makes a day feel visited by history. They splashed to the far bank and tapped the first stone. With their wands, a gentle rap that sounded exactly like an agreement. In the gap where the brook turned, the terrier instructed that the company should turn upon itself, so that the corner would live inside a well-fed memory, which they did, spinning slowly like a planet reconsidering its orbit. When they met, a hedge that had migrated, which hedges do even without walking, the company became cordial surveyors. The farmer said the hedge had been there forever. The oldest man said forever was shorter last year. The terrier said the hedge formerly bore a pot on a post, which was unhelpful except as a reminder that the pot's opinion mattered in 1691. They all looked for the old ditch at the hedge's feet, because ditches are quieter liars. A boy found the line by accident, his shoes sank into it up to dignity, and a small cheer rose. The wand tapped the earth as if christening it again. Each time a quarrel softened to laughter, you could see a town learning to be itself without shouting. It is hard to remain angry while holding a basket of buns. Midway through the circuit, the party arrived at a tree remarkable not for size but for character. Parsimonious with shade, grim about birds, this ash had served as a boundary longer than living memory, and looked as though it was tired of being reminded. Someone cut a tiny chip from the bark and tucked it into a pouch with chips from previous years, a pocket museum of bark organized by place rather than botany. The tree did not flinch. Trees are used to being theoretical. From there, the ground sloped toward a lane where the road, in a show of modest rebellion, refused to be straight. At a turning marked Hunger's Corner, they stopped to eat little pies. Boundary perambulations were work, but work with snacks is another kind of treaty. Then came a tradition that stands at the intersection of pedagogy and folklore, the bumping. At certain stones, which were never chosen for comfort, the younger. Members of the party were held by the arms and gently introduced to the angle of the world. The purpose was memory, and the method was surprisingly effective. Years later, a grown man could point to a wall and say, "Here I remember being explained to." The explaining was done with good humor. Mothers supplied additional layers of clothing, and someone offered the important consolation that the stone had been equally hard in 1743. The stone, for its part, took the tribute with Precambrian patience. You are free to fall asleep now with the knowledge that a town once installed its borders in a child's knees, like a set of coordinates only he could read. The second stretch of the walk drifted away from hedges toward the soft engineering of drainage. Boundaries enjoy water because water is both legal and visible. Ditches had individual names as if they were neighbors. The procession followed one called Paternoster Gutter, which was not religious but remembered the beads of rain during one plentiful spring. Here the terrier read, thence along the channel by the length of a slow prayer, which is an excellent unit of time. People stepped carefully so their shoes would remain shoes. They passed a cattle pond where a stake marked the point at which thirsty beasts were allowed to drink without trespassing, a jurisdiction for heads, not hooves. In late years, someone had driven in an iron bar to replace a rotted post. Iron is persuasive, but the wand still touched it just to be polite. At a bridge so small, it preferred to be called a plank. They paused for the ceremony of naming what was already named. "This is Squire's plank," the clerk announced, in memory of a squire who never crossed it, a joke told annually until it matured into scripture. The terrier, diligent as ever, added, "And at this spot a cart of bricks was once overset, whose bricks lie yet, which helped nobody but made the day richer somehow." They tapped the plank twice, the law's version of blessing, and stepped over. If anyone slipped, there was a custom for that. 2. The fallen person received a halfpenny fine payable immediately into the nearest pocket of the nearest child. A brisk economy that made falling popular among spectators. Open fields gave way to the sulking dignity of walls. One was dry stone, clever as a puzzle. Another was mortared, formal as a schoolmaster. A third stood only as a rumor of stones with grass in between. Walls are rarely where they should be, because weather enjoys pushing and people enjoy leaning. At a gap called the eye, they filed through sideways and turned to face it, hands raised in salute. The way you might salute a doorway that has worked hard since the last inspection. The terrier recommended chalking a cross on the nearest stone for clarity. Chalk has always been happy to provide clarity. They marked and admired the cross as if it had drawn itself. Then came the yearly encounter with the landowner, whose orchard grew along the exact line of the boundary, which is the sort of thing maps enjoy and people do not. He met them with as much hospitality as a boundary can afford. A plate of apples appeared as evidence that neighbors exist. The wand touched the outermost trunk, just the bark. Hardly a tickle, and the clerk recited the legal formula promising that the parish claimed the line, not the fruit, which put everyone's conscience at ease and did nothing to reduce the number of apple cores and hedges. For many years, a particular tree had been the landmark. When it blew down, the root was measured from its center to the line, and a stump became Old Apple and Ghost, which is a much better name than most towns give their roads dot as the day wore into the third stretch. The party found the places where memory worked hard, a bifurcated ditch, a hedge that rethought itself, an earthwork no one could agree whether Roman or enthusiasm. Here the witness tradition did its slow, sensible work. The oldest man remembered walking with his own grandfather. A document from 1712 remembered an argument about a cow of impartial moral character, who crossed here and had to be carefully escorted back. Someone brought out a folded paper, crisp as a winter leaf, titled Depositions Concerning the Bounds, in which ancestors testified with whimsical precision. I myself saw the beetle lie atop the stone in harvest of the year 92, one had written, which is both historical gold and a sentence to settle any dispute with laughter, when even witness memory failed. There was the terrier's peculiar poetry to guide them. Thence to the ash that hears the road, it might say, and though no ash can hear, the company understood which one it meant. By the 3 notched posts, it advised, and if only 2 notches remained, they took turns supplying the 3rd with chalk and optimism. To the gate that was not there, it sighed, a philosophical condition familiar to parishes in all centuries, and they honored it by standing where the gate would have been if history had been kinder. The wand, patient as a metronome, gave a little tap to air dot marking a river corner required small crafts that navigated importance at low speed. A coracle or skiff appeared from nowhere. Every town has a nowhere that stores useful things, and 2 people pushed off in it with a line. They stretched the line from post to tree while the clerk called out distances in fathoms and blanks, both equally reliable. On shore, the rest of the party ate cheese with the intense focus that only cheese can command and watched the line move across water like the idea of a boundary trying to learn to swim. When the knot found its place, cheers drifted like swans. Then they wrote, corner fixed by cord in sight of many witnesses, all of whom were busy at bread. From water to road, from road to yard, the last stretch crossed the human parts of the parish, where property corners leaned close to gossip. At a brewery yard starboard smell of malt, the boundary passed between a door and a drain, which required the company to thread like a needle through a scene of practical industry. Men in aprons nodded as if boundaries were just another recipe. At a blacksmith's, they left a chalk mark on the lintel because sparks had eaten the earlier marks. And the smith, who believed in iron more than chalk, grinned and said the mark would live as long as honest horses, which felt like the right length of time. Finally, inevitably, they arrived at the oddest ceremony of all, going through a building. Centuries shrink and expand around streets. At some point, a house had been built straddling the line, and rather than move the line or the house, the town moved its feet. The procession entered the front door to the astonishment of a cat, crossed the flagstones, and exited the back door to the relief of the same cat, which regained possession without filing paperwork. The clerk recorded, with admiration usually reserved for architecture, that we did go through Mrs. Sire's pantry, and sometimes added and were refreshed, which is how a ham sandwich becomes part of constitutional law. The 4th turn of the circuit bent toward home, and also toward the strangest thought of the day, that a boundary is a public, story told in steps. Nowadays, maps print everything with clenched precision. Satellites know a hedge better than its own birds. But the old method had a sleepier genius. It distributed knowledge across many souls like flour across a board. If you asked anyone in the company where the line went, they could tell you a stretch of it well. Altogether, they formed a map that could shake your hand. When a dispute did arise over a hedge that had quietly essayed itself outward, or a ditch that argued it was a brook now, the town rarely began with law. It began with shoes, and the shoes often solved what the law would only make more expensive. Some places still walk their bounds for the mild exercise it gives to memory. The willow wands have retired to museums where they lie very straight under glass. The terriers persist in archives, all texture and ink, waiting for hands that turn pages as if stroking animals. People still bump children on stones in a spirit of festive consent. The children roll their eyes and then remember anyway. A GPS can fit the parish into a small glowing rectangle, but the rectangle cannot point at the place where, in 1768, someone dropped a hat and therefore it became important. The rectangle also cannot accept a slice of pie, which the perambulation can. Generously, perhaps too generously, at 3 separate kitchens. Of course, the bounds were never perfect. There were places nobody loved. The nettle yard behind a tannery. The slot between walls where the sun visited like a forgetful ant. The decades-old heap of rubble described delicately as the former improvement. One year a bee swarm adopted the exact post they needed to touch. The company respected the bees and touched the ground nearby with a fastness that resembled bravery. Another year heavy snow convinced everyone that borders work better in spring. The clerk wrote weather incompliant and drew a small, apologetic cloud. If the terrier accumulated these gentle errors, it did so with a smile. The boundary was an agreement, and agreements breathe. A parish that walks itself learns useful slowness. Disputes are postponed long enough to grow smaller or to reveal they were only misunderstandings wearing big hats. The company discovers little things, a new footpath where there was only a hope, a promising elderberry bush cynical about harvest, a roof tile that has decided gravity is advisory. They say good morning in 10 different ways. They learn which dogs are philosophers and which are politicians. They discover that the world is rarely straight and almost never level, yet somehow accountable. It is difficult to keep a grudge while counting your steps toward a pie cooling on your neighbor's sill. When the line closes with the first willow again, there is no trumpet. The wand gives the tree one last courteous tap. The clerk's handwriting, steady as a small river, notes, perambulation complete, witnesses content. The bell that began the day hums a kind of amen without actually saying it. People shake hands with the relief of those who have proved something without shouting. The children compare bruises and pride. Both will heal admirably. Someone suggests tea, and the suggestion is ratified unanimously, for tea is the treaty beverage of English history. The terrier is folded and returned to its chest. The willow wand is leaned against a wall where it will look, for the next 11 months, exactly like a stick, if you can still hear me. Picture the line of the parish settling down for sleep, slightly polished by footfall. The brook turns in its bed and tells itself a story about clouds. The stones think their geological thoughts, which are patient and profound, and include no opinions about fences. A cat sits exactly on the boundary because cats enjoy bureaucracy. The memory of the walk hangs in the air like flour dust from a finished loaf. Tomorrow, people will go back to ordinary errands, eggs counted, shoes mended, roofs mumbled over, and the boundary will go back to being part of the background, which is where most important things live. And if you drift away now, the town will finish the circuit without you, and the map will be kept delicately in footsteps, and the willow will remember for us all. You might not think a country would try to divide the day into 10 hours just to see how it felt, but for a little while, France did exactly that. The plan was simple in the way snow is simple. It looked pure and clean, and then you had to walk in it. 10 hours a day, 100 minutes in each, 100 seconds in each minute, so reasonable that it almost makes you suspicious. If you're still awake after I explain how the decimal second was, technically shorter than the one on your phone, feel free to subscribe with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has adopted a very small clock. Or don't, I'll never know. The clocks from 1793 are not connected to anything. It began with people who were in the mood for straight lines. They had straightened titles, straightened measurements, straightened the idea of who got to wear a crown. And now they looked at time, which had been round and messy for ages, and thought this could use a ruler. A committee formed because committees love time. It stays for meetings even when people wish to leave. In tidy handwriting, they announced the decimal day and tried it on the calendar. the way a tailor tries a jacket on a reluctant cat. The old 24 hours, friendly, familiar, slightly shabby from centuries of use, were invited to step aside. In their place came 10 big slices of day, each so substantial you could spread a whole schedule on it. The new seconds were crisp, 0.864 of the old kind, which feels like nothing until you try to stir soup by them. A normal heartbeat became a little extravagant. Pendulums had to be recalculated, which made pendulums feel seen. Watchmakers went to their benches with the resigned joy of people who had been given new fractions to whisper to themselves. A few made exquisite decimal watches with 2 sets of numbers, the practical and the ideal writing one dial like roommates who agree to label their milk. Paris displayed public clocks with 2 faces, one sincerely revolutionary, one apologetically useful. They looked like a city that had chosen to wear both shoes just in case. On paper, the hours looked like tall houses arranged neatly along a boulevard. Hour 3 sat comfortably where our mid-morning lingers, thoughtful and receptive to coffee. Hour 5 became the new afternoon, full of errands and small triumphs. Hour 9, on the edge of sleep, stood there blinking like a lighthouse. People tried to talk in this new grammar. "I'll see you at the 76th minute," said one enthusiastic official, as if minutes were new pastries. Someone else answered, "Which set?" because they had a practical appointment to keep and didn't wish to be early by an entire mathematical theory. The baker, who believed in ovens more than decimals, nodded anywhere between hour 4 and hour 6 and achieved bread as usual, while the day was being decimated in a friendly way. The week tried something bolder and perhaps sillier. Out went the 7 days, and came the 10-day decade, full of days with names that sounded like polite cousins, primity, duody, treaty, all the way to decadi, which had a festive air and encouraged public rest, just often enough to make your feet grateful and your calendar suspect. Worked animals, suddenly given a holiday only every 10 days, could not be expected to vote, yet their opinion found its way into human knees. People discovered that 7 is an inconvenient number and therefore hard to replace. It fits in the hand like a stone that has been turned over by many thumbs. Meanwhile, the new months wore names that required a little poetry to pronounce. Brumaire with its fogs, Pluviese with rain that sounded like a folded French umbrella opening in the next room. The labels felt like a weather report read by a botanist who had overslept. Everything flourished that looked good in tens. Currency felt quite at home. Length, mass, volume, these agreed joyfully, and the meter, practical as a broom handle, became the basis for a civilized kind of certainty. But time resists. It is loyal to the sky. The sun kept showing up in the old places, a colleague who had not read the memo. Sunrises continued to pour into mornings that refused to be hour 2 with any conviction. Noon, which is a very old word and not easily moved, sulked somewhere between hour 4 and hour 6 and was no happier when given the sensible Latin explanation. Church bells, which had spent centuries ringing the day into neat prayers, were silenced by politics, and when they returned, they rang in ways clocks could not legislate. Still, some people loved the new arithmetic. Astronomers felt a thrill because the decimalized day made certain calculations purr like contented cats. Surveyors liked it because surveyors like anything that allows more columns in a clean notebook. Teachers enjoyed assigning problems in which a train leaves Lion at the 43rd minute of hour 4 and arrives precisely 4 decimal hours later. Thank you. Show your work. A pharmacist in Rouen converted his tincture schedule with zeal and watched medicines behave exactly as before, which pleased him quietly. On Ducati, he took his walk at the same sunlit time he had always taken it, feeling both modern and unchanged, which is the best kind of progress. Manufacturers tried to build the new day into brass. A clockmaker in the Marais produced a handsome instrument with two arcs, one 10-fold, one 24-fold, and a single tremulous hand that passed judgment on both worlds. Customers stood before it with the respectful puzzlement usually reserved for modern art. It worked beautifully when it worked. When it didn't, the hand hesitated as if it had discovered that belief is a gear that can slip. In workshops, apprentices learned that a decimal second sinks like a quick step under your toes. The old second had a broader plank. Musicians counted measures and decided, diplomatically, that human bodies tap their feet in 2s and 3s, regardless of what governments decree. The most heroic trial belonged to the public offices. Imagine a clerk writing letters by the 100, each dated the 3rd of Brumaire, in the year 2 at the 52nd minute of hour 7. The ink loved this. The paper felt important for the first time since vellum. People receiving the letters read them as one reads a menu in a foreign town slowly, trusting their appetite to guide them. Street markets tried to keep decimal time with the same air they used when a magistrate visited, respectful for a radius of 5 feet. Stalls open when daylight set, sew and close when mouths agreed. If you put a decimal clock next to a basket of pears, the pears declined to be punctual. They remained ripe or not in the old way. Gradually, though, something gentle occurred. People did not obey the new hours exactly. Instead, they let the new numbers lie down beside the old ones like layers of blankets. The meeting at hour 3. Well, 9 in the morning, someone would say, translating within the same breath. A mother told her child that bedtime came at the 80th minute of hour 8, which was true, useful, and instantly converted into yawns. A messenger announced that the coach to Ambient departed in half an hour and then added, "That is 30 terse minutes," giving arithmetic a little mustache for charm. The country lived at 2 tempos, like a piece of music written in 2-time signatures, whose performers touch elbows at the bar lines. Even an experiment requires an ending. After some years, the clocks with their delicate double numerals returned to the dignity of curiosity. People who had sworn eternal loyalty to decimal minutes found themselves unbending, not in disgrace but in relief, the way you might remove a stiff collar. The 7-day week arrived again like an old friend who knows your chair. The months resumed their Roman names, bringing with them the smell of schoolbooks. Noon returned to its stubborn post and has been there ever since, agreeable as a cat returned to its favorite windowsill. If the decimal day left any complaint behind, it was filed neatly in a drawer that no one opens unless they are moving house or teaching history to children. But traces remain, and they are delightful if you enjoy finding fossils and ideas. In museums, you can meet clocks with 2 sets of eyes, both calm, neither angry at the other. One shows the rational hope of 10, the other shows the human habit of 12 and 24. Some bear tiny inscriptions that feel like polite letters from failed utopias. In libraries, a few surviving timetables continue to behave in 10s, as if the trains were shyly proud of having once belonged to a numerical adventure. And in the language of science, decimals reign happily. Every lab clock clicks ordinary seconds, yet behind them live neat 10s that describe the world with the serene precision of a tailor who measures twice and cuts once. The best part, perhaps, is how the experiment gave everyone a new way to be amused by time. When you wait for a bus that is 10 minutes late, you can whisper to yourself that this is approximately 11 decimal minutes, which is a very cultured kind of lateness. When a recipe says bake for 45 minutes, you can imagine the revolutionary cook frowning at the number and rewriting it as 75 decimal minutes while making the same soup. When you decide to nap for 20 minutes, you may call it 33 decimal minutes and feel as though you have received a bonus for doing nothing, which is the most comfortable rebate in history. It also left behind a small wisdom about clocks and people. Measurements want to be tidy. Lives want to be livable. The meter became universal not because it flattered the world, but because it kindly matched it. The decimal day did not. It floated like a perfect paper boat in a river that insisted on going wherever it had always gone, around bends invented by mountains and conversations. The sun likes its own schedule and does not wear new hats easily. The moon, which has been in charge of months longer than anyone can remember, leaned on the sky and said nothing at all. Farmers kept their dawns. Children kept their evenings. Bakers kept the hour window base. Cats slept in whichever system featured SUNBEAMS dot, and yet the attempt feels endearing. There is tenderness in a nation that cared enough about logic to try it on the hour, and kindness in the way it let the hour slip back into comfort. The decimal second still glides elegantly through equations. The ordinary second keeps our tea from going over. Somewhere in a Paris attic, a clock with two faces ticks to itself, unharried by appointments, pleased to be a small museum of a thought. If you visit, you may find that your pulse moves in the old rhythm while your curiosity steps delicately intense. The moment will be peacefully bilingual. By now, the room is probably darker. The air has that end-of-day quiet that even decimal systems would call hour 9. The clocks around you keep their patient circles. They do not mind that once, for an amiable while, a handful of earnest people tried to make them count in a new way. The earnest people are gone to sleep as all people do, and their clocks rest like bright toys on the shelves of history. If you're still listening, consider that each second, however you measure it, arrives with the softness of a feather and leaves with the courtesy of a footstep in snow. The change from one to the next is so small it feels like kindness. It will continue whether you wake to watch it or drift into the comfortable arithmetic of dreams. You might not expect a nation to spend 6 centuries whispering into pieces of wood, but that is more or less what England did. The sticks were humble. Willow or hazel, usually. Not too round, not too proud. They fit in the palm like a promise you meant to keep later. Split lengthwise with a small knife, notched with careful nibbles, and then pocketed, stacked, or tied with string. If you stay with me while we talk about the angle of a notch that means 20 shillings, and the slightly different angle that means 40, you're doing very well. If you drift off before I reach the part about how a furnace grew overconfident, that's also very professional of you. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe with the measured enthusiasm of a clerk reaching for fresh ink. Or don't. Tally sticks are famously patient. A tally was a thought you could hold. Pick a slender rod. Make a cut for 1 pound, a long confident bite. Make a smaller one for a shilling, neat and businesslike. A whisper of a notch for a penny. The Exchequer, the Royal Accounting Office with a taste for chessboard tablecloths liked order, and the rod obliged. The stick was then split lengthwise through each notch, right down the grain, so the cuts crawled like fossils across 2 surfaces. The thicker half, the stock, stayed in Westminster. The slimmer half, the foil, walked back to the taxpayer. Each half would only ever marry its other again, teeth to teeth, proof without a word. Like 2 halves of a friendship bracelet, if friendship were billable. Wood remembered with a stubbornness that paper sometimes lacked. It also did not easily burn, at least not when wet with English weather and bureaucracy. Clerks learned a slow choreography. They tapped the blade into the timber with a rhythm as gentle as rain on oiled leather. Long notch for a pound. Across the stick. Short notch for a shilling. Across again. Small flick for a penny. The depth mattered. The angle mattered too, a habit developed by men with time to develop habits. A cut slanting just so could say 40. A different slant could say 60. In a quiet room, you could hear mathematics being carved into a branch as if the forest had taken an evening class. Some clerks cut with flourish, some with something like affection. The sticks accumulated, Not like coins that jingle, but like seasons that stack. A tally never argued. It did not smudge. It did not need a signature because the tree itself had signed long ago. If you brought your foil to the exchequer and it clicked perfectly into its stock, if the teeth met like old neighbors, you were paid. Or you were forgiven, or you were told gently that you were mistaken by exactly 1 penny. Look here, you see. On market days, a farmer might carry a foil tucked into his belt beside the knife that had freed it. It smelled faintly of sap and pocket. It worked even when rain bullied ink from paper. It ignored illiteracy entirely. Anyone with hands could read it. A tally was simultaneously practical and oddly tender, as if the government had chosen to keep its promises inside small pieces of countryside. People used them for more than taxes. A baker could tally bread for a customer who would pay when the harvest cheered up. A tavern might notch ale until wages arrived like a tide. A shepherd could mark sheep borrowed, cheese owed, favors exchanged. In villages where money was a rumor and trust was a muscle, the stick became a calendar of kindnesses. There were also less kind versions. Debts for tall men with tall tempers. Rents that grew a notch at a time until the wood itself seemed to sigh. Still, the idea remained reassuringly physical. To settle accounts, you brought 2 halves together and watched arithmetic stop pretending to be mysterious. Back at Westminster, the exchequer arranged its tallies in bundles. They tied them with twine. They shelved them, labeled them, and occasionally moved them when mice proved to be auditors. The tallies sat through rains, through plagues, through the sudden popularity of wigs. Some were as long as a forearm, a trophy for a very expensive obligation. Others were as thin as a promise you could almost forget. They watched new ideas arrive and depart. Coins changed. Weights and measures flirted with improvement. Writing styles grew Baroque, then prim, then Baroque again. The sticks did not care. They held their teeth and waited for their matches. This patience led to a curious habit. Because a tally was genuinely hard to fake, it began to behave like money. If a man held a foil that said the crown owed him 5 pounds in Michaelmas, he could pass the foil to someone else in exchange for grain today. The someone else could pass it further on, and soon you had a little stream of wooden IOUs trickling through markets. It was an early bond market disguised as a woodland stroll. Sometimes long before the due date, the foils skimmed half the county, returning finally to the exchequer sunburned with handling and happy to be reunited. Financial historians get very excited here. Everyone else nods sleepily and pictures a desk covered in willow. Notches have personalities. The deep bites for large sums looked confident, certain of their footing. The penny cuts, neat and precise, resemble the scratch a cat makes at the door when it wishes to be included but not obliged. In years of famine, the small marks multiplied. In years of prosperity, the long gouges appeared like careful hedges in a field. The wood recorded weather with sap and policy with geometry. Where paper produces paragraphs, the tally offered one honest line after another. Even the splinters, should they rise, carried information. A broken tooth could cost someone a morning and a case of nerves, and perhaps that is why the clerks wrapped bundles carefully and tapped the edges straight on the table the same way librarians square a stack of books. When printing arrived, the sticks nodded politely. When double-entry bookkeeping strutted in from Italy with ink on its cuffs, the sticks raised their wooden eyebrows and continued to be themselves. The world grew complicated, and then more complicated still. Trade became long-legged. Ships wrote lines across oceans. Spices and sugar taught accountants to sit down. Yet the Chancellor of the Exchequer, planning the nation's finances, continued to rely on bits of willow that innocent rivers had known personally. Laws affirmed them. Auditors defended them. If you wanted to know who owed what to the crown, the answer lived in a cupboard that smelled like an after-rain walk. There's an odd comfort in a system that refuses to be hurried even by centuries. It brings a kind of bedtime traffic hum to the past. You can almost hear it, the soft scrape of knife on stick, the cluck as the two halves meet, the sigh of twine being tied, the clerk's pen scratching the short note that says which bundle dreams in which cubby. On quiet afternoons, the exchequer looked like a forest had gone to finishing school. Wood lined the shelves, wood supported the roof, wood slept in the account books as paper, and in a cupboard somewhere Mouse considered whether accounting was edible and decided reluctantly that it was not. But fashions shift, even very polite ones. By the 18th century, the tally system began to feel like wearing your grandfather. S-coat in a summer parade, respectable, warm, not quite breathable. Paper had improved. Banks had ideas. Governments grew fond of numbers that could stand at attention in columns and salute. Tally sticks persisted in the way that habits with good stories do. One can imagine a junior official suggesting their retirement and then discovering how many senior officials had learned their own father's faces in rooms full of those sticks. Tradition has leverage. It can push against the future with one thumb and say, not yet. By the early 19th century, however, someone finally made a list headed old tallies to be disposed of. That is an innocent phrase until it meets a fireplace. The exchequer, being a place of accounts, counted its old sticks in the many, many thousands. The plan seemed simple. Feed the retired pieces to the stove. Let the rooms be warmed one last time by promises that had already kept themselves. In 1834, this tidy idea met a furnace that had the soul of a storyteller. It loved to exaggerate. The fire caught the wood a little too gladly. The heat strolled beyond its job description. Chimneys discovered ambitions. Flames leapt politely to the rafters and then impolitely to the sky. We do not need to dwell on that. It was, by bedtime standards, a bit dramatic. The important part is something softer. People afterward remembered the irony. A kingdom's old accounting, meant to prove forever that wood could be trusted, had misbehaved only when no longer tasked with anything at all. The sticks themselves were not at fault. Retired employees rarely are. It was the enthusiasm of their farewell that caused trouble. In the daylight that followed, the offices found new rooms. Paper got the promotion it had been rehearsing for. Books multiplied like rabbits who had discovered ledgers. Tally sticks mostly left, as loyal devices do, without bitterness. Yet they did not leave entirely. They linger in museums, shy and competent. Some still wear their twine. Some still bear the nicknames of long-vanished places, scratched briefly on the back in ink that looks like weather. If you pick one up carefully, it balances between old counting and a friendly twig you could tuck behind your ear. The notches remain readable, like a poem you can hum without learning the words. Long cut, short cut, little scratch. They explain in silence that people believed in them. They ask you gently to notice how much can be remembered by something that never learned to spell. It is pleasant to think how a tally moved through hands, from a collector of taxes with boots the color of roads, through a purse that also held a single coin and a piece of string, across a tavern table where a farmer traded it away for seed and an optimistic discussion about weather, into the pocket of a merchant who understood that the crown was a very dependable debtor in the long run, then to a clerk who checked the fit against the stock with the calm of a locksmith. "Click," said the wood. "I agree," said the crown. The whole journey looks like someone folding a map neatly, one crease at a time. Tally sticks also knew patience in debt. A landowner with more opinions than money might gift a bundle to a creditor, and the creditor would smile in the way a person smiles who appreciates both arithmetic and timber. In a crisis, a town could pledge future tax tallies to repair a bridge, and the bridge would open like a sigh of relief. The sticks were tiny bridges themselves, with the river of time running through their grain. If you have ever kept a grocery list on the back of a receipt, you already understand their philosophy. Writing can be paper. Writing can also be a method that refuses ink entirely and trusts the feel of a notch under your thumb. Modern people sometimes stare at them and wonder how anyone tolerated such quaintness. But there is a kind of modernity that lives in quiet tools. Consider the split ticket system itself, a built-in double check, the two halves revealing forgery by refusing to fit. That is two-factor authentication expressed in Willow. Consider their portability, their immunity to rain, their full legibility without schooling. That is user experience before the phrase could frighten anyone. Consider their recyclability, the way they return to heat and light. That is circular economy with a literal circle of seasons. Old solutions occasionally dress like new ones and wave from across the centuries with the polite smile of cousins at a wedding. If you go looking, you'll find tallies in literature too. A line here, a joke there. Dickens notices them lying in baskets, looking like dry crusts of bread. Antiquarians discuss their species of wood with the patience of gardeners who have not yet chosen where to plant the gooseberries. A few poets enjoy the word tally, which is lovely to say and sounds like a dish you might serve with jam. Accountants in the 19th century kept specimens in drawers the way seashell collectors keep fossils of old waves. When curious visitors came, the host might take out a stick, let light run along its notches, and demonstrate how history fits back together with a click you can feel in your teeth. Meanwhile, somewhere in a back field, a farmer continued to tally lambs on a stick because it was easier than bringing a notebook past an enthusiastic dog. A miller tallied sacks because flour sheds punctuation. A schoolmaster tallied the wins of a village cricket side until a paper scorebook arrived, which it did, and which was extremely proud of itself. The old stick, retired, became a kindling that remembered summer. If the cricket side lost that day, the fire did not mind. It cheered them anyway, in its small way, with warmth. We can also admire the democratic politeness of the system. A tally is not private. It is not locked in a vault where only specialists can nod at it. It allows the person who owes and the person who is owed to carry the same truth around in their pockets, literally split between them. Truth in halves, verification by reunion. It is difficult to think of a more charming metaphor for ordinary trust. You could accuse medieval administration of many complicated things, but you cannot accuse it of lacking a poetic streak when it selected trees to keep the books. There is even a miniature geometry lesson. A notch for a penny does not simply mean penny. It means also that the stick is long enough to host it, that there is room for next year, that the future marches along the grain like a procession of careful ants. A very great debt produces a remarkable stick-thick authoritative, the way a walking staff looks after someone has walked with it a very long time. Small debts flit like finches across slender twigs. Any museum shelf that hosts a collection of tallies resembles an aviary for mathematics. The room is calm. The birds do not sing. They are sleeping with their beaks folded under their wings. Because the Exchequer loved organization, it tried from time to time to reform its wood, its standardized lengths. It suggested better knives. It argued quietly about whether hazel made more dignified notches than willow. Committees met because that is what committees do. They issued memoranda that no one remembers and labels that everyone removed. In the end, the best reform was the same old practice done with a fresh strand of twine. Progress sometimes looks like a new bow on an old parcel. The parcel does not complain. If you listen closely, the whole story is full of small sounds. The drawer sliding open, the bundle lifted with a palm under the belly, the whisper of a string being untied, the pause, the click. If you were a child allowed to stand in the doorway, you might remember that click all your life. Perhaps you would become an adult who trusts small proofs. Perhaps you would love receipts and logs and recipes written in your grandmother's hand. Or perhaps you would simply love the quiet idea that the world can agree on something and store the agreement in something that once had leaves. Even as they left, tallies taught a last lesson. Institutions keep their memory in strange places. Some memories are excellent at arithmetic but poor at firefighting. Some are exquisite at public ritual and terrible at discussing retirement. The sticks forgave all this, I am sure. Wood is kind. It grew by listening to wind and learned its patience from rain. When it entered the furnace, it did what wood does and became warmth, which is what numbers secretly hope to be when they grow up. Today, if you handle money, or save a receipt, or watch two halves of a concert ticket being torn, you are practicing the descendants of old notches. If you split a bill at dinner and each person keeps a photo of the total, that is a digital foil in stock. When your phone asks for a code that only your other device can produce, that is a wooden idea wearing glass. When you wrap a task with a piece of string in your head and promise to come back to it, you are figuratively shelving a tally. The line between the medieval and the modern is sometimes just the difference between willow and electricity. And so we arrive at the sleepy part, where the sticks go back to being sticks. Picture a shelf in a quiet gallery. Afternoon light leans through high windows, thinking about nothing in particular. 3 or 4 tallies lie under their labels. A guard dozes with expertise. Someone whispers to a companion that the long cut is £1. The companion nods as if they have always known. Outside, a tree grows without planning to be an instrument, which is how most instruments begin. The world ticks on, not with pendulums, but with agreeable pulses. Footsteps down the hall. A watch's gentle heart, your own. If you're still awake, you may find yourself counting the small things around you, the folds in a blanket, the slats in a blind, the breaths between sentences, all good tallies. Notches without knives, proofs without paper. Nothing dramatic, nothing that needs a furnace, only quiet halves waiting to meet. And if you drift, the story will hold its place, as wooden things do, and continue when you come back, adding 1 soft notch for sleep and 1 for waking, and 1 for the pleasant business of forgetting exactly where you were. You might not expect a nation to keep its sense of distance asleep in a velvet-lined box, but that is more or less what Britain did for a very long time. The yard 3 feet, 36 inches, the length of a brisk nod, was not born heroic. It was cast in bronze and taught to nap in a low drawer. When it was awake, it was exactly itself, only at a particular temperature, which is a fussy way of saying the bar breathed with the weather. On warm days, it felt expansive. On cold ones, it practiced restraint. Clerks learned to befriend thermometers as if they were opinionated cats. If you stay with me through a quiet discussion of witness marks, gauge blocks, and the leisurely career of a man whose job was to carry a traveling yard on a cushion, you deserve a ribbon. If you drift off before we get to the screws, the bar will understand. If you're still awake a little later, feel free to subscribe calmly, the way one might place a paperweight on a map so counties don't wander. Or don't. The yard will remain the same length either way, give or take a whisper of Celsius. The Old Kingdom had many yards, just as it had many cheeses, but only one was allowed to look unimpressed in official company. It lay in the custody of the Parliament and endured a life that could be summarized as horizontal, verified. This bar had 2 faint scratches in its top surface witness marks between, which the distance was declared to be 1 yard when the metal was a particular kind of comfortable. No one measured from the ends. Ends warp and gossip. One measured from inside the lines, the way sensible people read a contract. Clerks in dark coats lifted a matching bar from its box, let the browns consider the room, and then coaxed the 2 together with a gentleness that would not wake a sleeping spoon. They checked the temperature. They wrote the reading with a nib that had its own opinions about humidity. In that quiet ritual, the country's tailors, surveyors, sailors, and shopkeepers received the same length without ever attending the ceremony. The bar was not immortal. Friars took an interest in Westminster in 1834 and expressed their views with unusual enthusiasm. Afterwards, there was an important meeting with the tone of people replacing a very dignified hat. Committees designed new standards out of bronze that preferred not to rust and shapes that pretended not to bend. The masters of length chose a lozenge cross-section because it offered certain geometric pride, and they mounted the bar on delicate supports so gravity would not encourage any extra opinions. They placed the new yard in a vault, gave it companions, and established a family of copies. Master No. 1, Master No. 2, and so on, like a set of cousins who enjoy formal dinners. Each cousin lived in a lined case with an address, a custodian, and a temperament. If a provincial office needed to confirm its tape measures, it could invite a cousin to tea and compare witness mark to witness mark, as if the empire were a polite club of rulers visiting one another's mantles. Comparisons had a choreography. The bars rested on rollers or knife edges to discourage sulking. A magnifying microscope peered at the witness marks, while a fine screw nudged the travel at an adjustable carriage until the lines were friends at last. Breathing near the apparatus was discouraged. So were opinions. Air currents counted as gossip. Observers took turns because no one wanted to be accused of seeing what they wanted to see. The numbers that appeared in the journals were patient numbers, rubbed smooth by repetition. On some days, the most dramatic event was an inkblot deciding on a landing site. On others, a clerk discovered a speck of lint in the wrong place and felt the deep, chastened thrill of someone who has rescued truth from a sweater. Because buildings are fond of climate, rooms for standards were taught to be boring in a very professional way. Temperature swung slowly. Light entered only after knocking. Doors sighed shut like librarians. The bars lay on their supports at just the right points along their length. Not at the ends, not at the middle, but at the airy points, which are as soothingly named as they are carefully located. If you placed the bar there, it sagged the least. This reduced the amount of arithmetic necessary to postpone the bending of reality. A man once spent a winter making sure the supports were at those points, and spoke of it later as if it had been a pilgrimage, which, in a sense, it was. Out in the world beyond the velvet box, the yard had a practical social life. It introduced itself to roads, to bridges, to fields that wanted to be farms, and to ships that wished to know whether a channel was feeling shallow. It shook hands with timber and rail and cloth. Tailors cut coats that fit bodies that insisted on being stubbornly human. Surveyors walked hedges with chains that had a set number of links, each expecting to be a certain number of inches, which themselves trusted the yard the way you trust a reliable neighbor with a spare key. An old chain stretched a little over the years and developed a fondness for stories. When that happened, someone had to take it to a yard cousin and remind it gently what honesty looks like, which is just 2 scratches on bronze. In the same basement, or close cousin to it, the pound sat with comparable gravity. Where the yard measured the polite distance between scratches, the pound expressed how hard a piece of metal could lean into the palm of the world. It began as a collection of equal-minded brass, and then graduated to platinum being the sort of element that prefers the company of velvet. Balances with pans and little riders weighed their own thoughts first and then the world's. People placed small weights on one side, adjusted with a dusting of caring, and waited for the beam to consider. It often looked as if nothing happened, which is the favorite way important things occur. The set of weights traveled under seal, their certificates folded like quiet flags. A market might calibrate its scales at the beginning of a season. A mint would weigh coins until the coins confessed who they were. The yard and the pound conspired with screws, which is more interesting than it sounds and almost as slow. Threads on bolts roamed the 19th century like dialects. A machinist in Manchester spoke in 24 threads per inch, while a fellow in Glasgow preferred a different pronunciation. Joseph Whitworth, who enjoyed straight lines to an almost pastoral degree, proposed a standard form angles, depths, the whole etiquette of turning metal into a helical promise. The nation nodded and began to make machine parts that fit, even when meeting for the first time in a damp yard. This was not romance, exactly. It was something steadier. You could unship a broken bolt on Monday and replace it with a well-mannered cousin on Tuesday. The yard whispered agreement down the threads, and the pound nodded from the balance. A traveling inspector, imagine a person with a suitcase full of calm, would visit towns like a modest comet. He carried secondary standards and a book of notes in which the pages had developed a nice curve from being turned with respect. Shopkeepers laid out weights whose brass had turned a friendly butter color. Measures of ale and grain stood to attention. The inspector compared each to the traveling truth. Sometimes he scratched a small crown mark as if knighting the object for honesty. Sometimes he sighed and chalked a correction on the slate. The public watched like an audience at a gentle horticultural show. Prizes were not awarded. Respect was. Markets functioned not because trust fell from the sky, but because length and weight were uniforms from the same quiet tailor. Trains enjoyed all of this more than they knew. Rails with proper gauge expected wheels with proper confidence, and carriages not too proud and not too shy. Schedules turned minutes and miles into acquaintances. A milepost did not argue with a timetable because both had shaken hands with the yard, and the yard had shaken hands with the bar in the drawer. When the post office promised a delivery by a certain day, the promise rode rails that relied on bolts, that used threads that had been whispered into shape by a standard. None of this placed a hat on a statue. It simply made the statue's plinth exactly as long as the drawing said it would be, which is one of the nicer compliments you can pay a drawing. There is an old rumor that the width of a railway, through a chain of decisions involving horses and Roman roads, explains the size of certain rockets. The rumor is tidy and wrong, but its popularity reveals how much we enjoy blaming the present on the past. Standards do something gentler. They let thousands of small choices agree to meet for tea. A bolt fits a nut made in a different town because both have practiced placing their elbows on the table at the same polite angle. A tailor's yard and a surveyor's chain and a shipwright's rule do not share an ancestor's eyebrow. They share a habit of calling the same thing by the same name and meaning it. Of course, the world eventually invited the yard to meet the meter, a French acquaintance who brought to dinner a very precise idea of the earth and a talent for decimal conversation. For a time, the two chatted across the channel through careful comparisons, the way neighbors might compare garden walls by measuring a shadow and a certain reassuring distance from the rhubarb. Converters marched along the margins of textbooks like well-shined beetles. Engineers carried pocket tables that could tell you, with a sigh, what 3 yards and a bit were in meters and another bit. Ships leaving Liverpool met meter-minded ports and discovered that ramps and rules can be bilingual if taught slowly. In Paris, the meter traveled with platinum iridium friends named after the practice of their personalities' prototypes. Exemplars, the sort who eat exactly half a croissant because the definition calls for it. For a long time, the British yard and the French meter simply existed together like sensible relatives. If you lowered your voice and compared them, you learned that one could be expressed in the other with a patience that felt like counting to 1,000 while the kettle boils. Later, a treaty ensured peaceful coexistence among measuring bars, and someone with good handwriting recorded the conversion exactly enough to make bridges content and buildings meet at the corners without a duel. The 20th century then performed its favorite trick, replacing objects with ideas. Scientists grew fond of defining things not by bronze and velvet, but by behavior and light. The meter stopped depending on metal and began believing in the distance light travels in a certain fraction of a second. The second itself stopped asking the sun and began trusting atoms, which is rather like switching from a sundial to a choir that sings on pitch forever. Somewhere in there, the kilogram, which had been the friend who always brought a particular heavy cookie to the party, learned to introduce itself by Planck's constant, a number that behaves like a ruler made of music. The pound remained politely local and useful. The yard did too. Both discovered they could live happily on the same street as the speed of light without needing to borrow sugar. Even so, the old bars did not retire to dramatic applause. They simply continued to lie in their drawers, useful for teaching and sentiment. Universities showed students the witness marks the way grandparents show children the chair in which certain wise things were once said. Museum cases warmed the bars with careful light as if making tea for them. When a historian visits, a curator may lift the lid and let air that smells like paper introduce itself to metal that smells like a patient argument. The bar does not speak. It lets a lens go to work and permits a notebook to become slightly heavier with pencil. A charming side alley of all this is the habit of making gauge blocks little steel, rectangles polished so flat that two of them will cling together by surface romance alone. These blocks build up links with a friendliness that machinists trust. A small block shakes hands with another, and then a third, until a desired length exists like a good sentence made of quiet words. They live in velvet too, because velvet apparently is where good manners sleep. When a tool room assembles a stack to calibrate a caliper, somewhere a clerk from 1856 would approve from his bench, recognizing the same geography of patience, corners true, faces honest, numbers content to share a line. On the retail street, most people met standards as a stamp. The pint in a pub wore a small crown and a year, the glass announcing that it had been introduced to truth and kept the acquaintance. A market scale showed a seal. A fuel pump, years later, would greet an inspector with resigned dignity, and after the visit, it would continue to deliver liters or gallons with the minimum of fuss and the maximum of routine. It is hard to build a statue to routine, but society keeps one in its pocket anyway. You can feel it in the way two pieces from different boxes agree about the distance between holes. Once in a while, the past makes a gentle joke. You can measure the speed of light in feet per second if you like. The number is simply bigger and noisier. You can express the height of a person in meters and then convert it to hands as if describing a horse. You can buy a yard of cloth in a shop that keeps both a yardstick and a metric tape and watches customers choose the one that best matches their inner arithmetic. The tailor smiles and cuts either way. The cloth never takes sides. It just drapes with quiet professionalism. I like to imagine, on a winter afternoon, an inspector from 1902 sitting beside an inspector from today. They would agree immediately about tea. They would agree, after a moment, about the purpose of their work. Not to make people nervous, but to let them relax. To buy a pound of apples that is not a poem. To follow a map whose inch equals a mile but does not wander. To fit a bolt into a nut on a ladder that holds a painter who is thinking about sky. They would both recognize the tender thrill of watching a pointer settle. They would both keep their pencil sharp. There is an even sleepier corner, the way documents describe all this. Acts of Parliament speak about measures and voices so calm they could soothe a cat. Be it enacted, they murmur, that the yard shall be kept here and the pound there, and that the officer in charge shall have a seal and a budget for coal. Minutes of committees record that Applewood cases are, on the whole, satisfactory. That the hinge of Master No. 3 makes his squeak not entirely consistent with dignity. That the thermometer in the south wall shows a listless preference for self-expression. These are the small breaths by which a civilization arranges its drawers. After so many careful afternoons, the habit of precision becomes part of the furniture. People build shelves that swallow brackets you did not notice. Doors that close with that good final sound. Shelves that accept books thicker than their spines look. In the background lurks the yard, rehearsing its quiet party trick of sameness. You can be a poet and still adore a standard. You can be an engineer and still fall asleep, smiling at the ridiculous idea that 2 scratches on bronze once gave an empire permission to agree. Toward evening, the vault cools a little. Metal rests as all useful things rest, by remembering what they are. The witness marks do not move any more than constellations do in a single blink. A label curls slightly at the corners and is gently replaced. Somewhere a tailor returns a yardstick to its place near the shears and switches off a lamp. Somewhere a survey chain coils with the sigh of a cat rounding itself into sleep. Somewhere a small crown stamped on a pint glass sits under a film of drying foam that says enough for tonight, we will pour again tomorrow. If you are still awake, you can count the modest triumphs around you, the equal steps of floorboards, the dependable width of a book, the way a table meets a wall without either claiming an extra inch of bedroom. These are small friendships negotiated long ago by people who pace rooms with bars and balances and the serene ambition that measurements should not surprise anyone. If you drift, the bars will keep their watch. They are very good at it. They have practiced for centuries. They know how to lie quietly, warm in their cases, while the room grows dim, and the air relaxes and the numbers. Content for once not to be pursued, place their heads on the same pillow, and agree to be the same in the morning.